Good afternoon. Jennifer Hoffmann is an artist working with clay. Currently based in Chicago, she studied at Parsons, New York, and is originally from Toronto, Canada. She has done residencies at Township 10, North Carolina, Lakeside Inn, Michigan, and Hyde Park Art Center, Chicago. She has exhibited at Hyde Park Art Center, Chicago, Elmhurst Art Museum, Elmhurst, Illinois, and the Walker Art Museum, Minneapolis, Jacqueline Sullivan Gallery, New York City, and Volume Gallery, Chicago, among others. Volume Gallery writes that her emotional, intuitive studio practice produces forms to explore the world around, whether they are forms detailing personal intimacy or forms reflecting her observations and feelings about community and society in times of upheaval, empathy, and change. Let's give her a round of applause.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's such an honor to be here with you. Thank you so much, Ian, for giving me this opportunity. It's almost a bit emotional, and I won't get emotional yet, but I get emotional, so be prepared. To be at this institution, speaking in front of you all, considering my path was not so easy in terms of getting to a place where I felt comfortable, and even still to call myself an artist. So it's really a pleasure to be here. So I'm gonna start with a video to sort of just invite you in, because my preference would have been to have you all over to my space. I have 4 cats. So I feel like I have to do this for maybe my mother more than my father, but my father as well. I wanted to, before I get into the work, just kind of expand on the bio that was written. My parents were German immigrants. Sorry, I lost my mother very young. She was 47 when she died. My German father was very strict growing up, and art was not encouraged, nor was it something that was supported as a career pursuit. My mother loved clothing, and I think my interest in clothing when I was younger was somewhat of a visual pursuit. It was a way to paint on the body almost. I think of clothing almost like painting on the body rather than fashion per se, and sculpt on the body to play with color, with line and proportion. And it ultimately was a way for me to travel away from a very controlling father to New York City in 1993 after my mother died. So I completed a political science degree in Canada, and then found my way to Parsons. And the reason I did was because they had a design marketing degree. So that kind of ticked the boxes for my father, and it allowed me to get to a city where I knew I would, sort of be confronted and find a more creative place. After my first year at Parsons, I wanted to transfer into the art major. However, I didn't have that support, and now wish with the artistic spirit that I had done it anyway. But I was lucky that I, in socializing, met a contingent of RISD graduates similar, to your age. And I think, I think they were ready. They had just come out of a school that had sort of the rigor of Cranbrook, and I was lucky to sort of almost be adopted by them. So outside of this design marketing degree, I was running around with, these people that were ready to come to New York and make an art career. And it was exciting, running around to galleries and, just deciding that I want to do that too. I want to be a painter. So in that time, I was sort of painting a little bit in my spare time, and but still doing this degree. And I met a guy named Miguel Drover. So I sort of got distracted a little bit from the art making and found myself in the fashion world. He was someone that knew Alexander McQueen really well. And so I got sort of caught up in his story, and basically he wanted to do a line, and I became his press person, and I had this experience where his trajectory got big very fast, so I got sucked up into the fashion world. So I did that for a few years. And I also, it was another way to learn about creativity and be around a section of people that were doing things that were very exciting. I wanted to just mention the fact that I'm a mother, because that was another thing that sort of not distracted me. It was a fantastic thing when I got married and had Dean and Apollonia and moved to Boston and sort of took on being a mother while Michael started his academic pursuit. So during that time, I did creative projects that sort of involved my kids. I had a line of T-shirts with my drawings. I kind of made these fabric and textile, like owls. So I was always doing something creative, but not yet really making art. Oops, sorry. Sorry, I need to go back. How do I go back? Oh, yeah. Okay. So that little piece on the right is one of the first things I ever made in clay. And as someone working in clay that didn't go to art school, my relationship to it developed after I left New York. I moved to Chicago because my former husband got a job there, and I still had young kids. And I think, like many people, I took a clay class, and I started throwing on the wheel, and that quickly, and then learning some basic hand building skills, and that quickly turned into jumping off of the wheel or adding things to wheels thrown things. And I'm just going to move to this. Oh, sorry. I work quite quickly, and when I make things, and I realize that clay can be a slow process where there's waiting periods. So in the beginning, I was just anxious to make what I wanted to make, and I discovered that pinching pieces of wet clay allowed me to work quicker and build my forms higher, faster. So essentially, in the beginning, my relationship to the material was defined by speed. When I was pinching, I started to work in a kind of meditation, like reaching a place of flow with the process. I was thinking about community. I was looking around at the lake and at the buildings, and the pinches started to become almost like individuals in a way. The pieces were bigger than myself, and I liked that sort of symbolism of what the pinches could represent. they became whatever story or whatever thing I was thinking about in terms of what was going on in the world. And I felt like I was making something that was about more people than just myself. So this process of pinching became almost a primary language over the years. I'm going to show you just like a selection of earlier works when I first started. I didn't really have a plan. Each piece was spontaneous, made very quickly. And I feel like, I guess I should mention here too, I didn't know anything about people making ceramics, sculpture. I didn't know artists making ceramics. I was sort of in this little bubble of, that bubble you find in your studios where you can just sort of disappear and make without knowing anything. So there was a real freedom at that time. And I think I talked in one of the studio visits about it's okay to make things that almost don't look like many different things so that it looks like many different artists have made them. I mean, I think that was what I was doing in the beginning, but it was a way to just take it all in and not sort of just find it, So I was sort of doing everything. I'll show you these. These were really early pieces. You can see I was like throwing bad vessels, and then I was like cutting things out, and I was painting things, and I was still looking at things that, again, I guess were traditional things that you learn when you first learn ceramics: a bowl, a vase, a basket. I started, playing with texture. When I draw, I tend to use a lot of crosshatch and stippling, so I started throwing that onto objects. I showed this is sort of funny. I was playing with a mold that was in the studio I was working at, and when I popped the mold out, the bottom looked like a breast, and then I was like, oh, maybe I'll make a breast object. And so that grew out of that, and it actually became quite popular, and I think I made a couple of those and then moved on. But, it was just working with a random mold that sort of inspired that piece. And I started, I think, moving, I don't think of myself as a ceramicist, a potter. I don't even think I don't have the technique or the expertise or the talent, frankly. I look up to people that do. I think I quickly was drawn to the sculptural aspect of clay. It let me work with my hands in a way that felt both grounding and freeing. There's something immediate and alive in shaping a form, a kind of dialogue between your body and the material. And over time, I realized that sculpture is it's like another language for me. It became a way for me to explore ideas, memories, my current feelings, maybe too much sometimes, giving them a tangible form and allowing me to engage with them in a very physical and present way. I love to work intuitively. I'm terrible. I'm not a good planner. I've become a little bit better, but intuitively, and just allow the forms to be channeled from my body and through my hands. In the beginning also, because I think of my background in clothing and sort of being very specific, and painting and color, I was really, I didn't glaze a lot. I was scared of it, only because it's not immediate like paint. And I saw so many kind of failed experiments with it on other people's pieces, but also mine. So I almost thought that I would rather sort of get a feeling within the sculpture first, and you could almost intuit a color to it if you wanted, rather than try to put a color on it that wouldn't elevate the piece. All right, next. I guess when the work these are earlier pieces too, you can see I was sort of playing with bodies interacting. I was ripping scoring, coming together, sort of falling apart. When the work is complete, I feel like maybe there's an embodiment, perhaps, that tells a story loosely of the human condition. Again, feelings, aspirations, love, sadness, loss, and living. In the beginning, I was playing also with walls and like this pinching aspect of getting higher faster. I was playing with waves and walls and them made up of prints of all of us. So the water was sort of also talking about community. And then I sort of enjoyed the back, became sort of a scaffolding. And I kind of liked the way that looked as it sort of also represented where I was in my clay journey. I was learning techniques as I went. And so it almost revealed, in reality, it kept the piece, afloat. But it also symbolically was sort of an indication of where I was. I had a lot to learn. It was sort of something holding me up, holding the piece up. Needing help to stay intact. This also was an example of sort of, I was going through a lot personally at the time. I was wrapping, I was ripping things apart. I was sort of thinking about the internal and the external, hiding the internal, but then exposing it again. I was also, before the pinching became a real language, I was rapping a lot and looping and trying to figure out ways to attach. This was also a piece, I did these cutouts. These are, a lot of this language I didn't even further explore because I was, just taking it all in and making and moving from one piece to the next. These are more wrapping pieces, dealing with issues of trust and hugging and holding on, multiple hugs, smothering hugs. I started making some nest-like pieces, thinking of home, playing with mark making, adding pencil and other materials onto the clay, drawing on the clay. And then I'll pivot, so maybe around 2015 and 16, so up until now, I was just sort of making things. I was just going to the studio while my kids were at school and making things. And then I started to want people to see the work. And because of my, my experiences in clothing along the way, I had met some people with shops around the world. And I thought, well, maybe I'll ask them to, take a few pieces. And they were shops that, they weren't just like clothing shops. They had intention, they were curated, there were other objects there. So there was an artful feeling in these shops, but it was a way for me to finally have people engage with the work. It was a proposal to see if is this am I on the right track? Am I doing something? And so this on the left was a piece I did, and I put that in Lakeside. There was a shop of a friend, and I had met Mariam Nazir Zadeh while I was doing work in Paris with a clothing line called Bless, which is sort of an interesting one because they do artful objects, but also do a line of clothing. And so I put work in her store, which is here. So these were some early pieces. And they weren't ideal for retail, and I knew that. I would drive them. I didn't even know how to ship work at this point, and really understand the fragility of the work. But yeah, it was sort of a way to take them out of my space and see what the bigger world would think of them. This was in London. There was a place called the Blue Mountain School, and they were starting a ceramics program. Sort of integrating it with other objects. And then there was a place called Cornell Florist in Hyde Park where I was making my work, and I would, plop things in there, functional things that were, different textural things I was working on, just to test things out. And then after that, I'm going to move to shows. It was I guess what I'm trying to sort of show you is sort of the pathway that isn't always, it's not always the same. So this little floral shop turned into my first show. We emptied out the shop, and I had a show in there. And so this was great. It was a way for me to think about how I would present the work, but also to invite people. I invited Volume Gallery. They didn't come to this show. It's the gallery I show with now. Bill O'Brien, who some of you may know as he's a pretty big ceramic artist, came to this show and was one of the only people that bought a piece. But it was, it was a moment of, I guess, validity to keep going. And Volume ended up seeing the invite and asking for a studio visit after that show, and came over to my house that I showed you. And at the end of the studio visit, they basically said, "We've applied with your work to NADA," which is ridiculous, and I kind of was a little taken. Now I almost feel like it was very bold, but at the time it felt exciting. And I didn't really have a lot of time to get ready. I had enough work, certainly, but I thought also I needed to make new work. So this was a selection of work that they took. And and then that led to Volume offering me my first show. And I guess an important thing I wanted to mention here is that when they offered me the show, the first thing I thought, and I had a discussion today, was that I needed to make bigger things. That was my panic. I need to make bigger things. And I was working at a public studio that wouldn't allow me to make big things. And the person that was sort of running the studio in a very loose way, I asked him if he would fire a bigger piece, which he responded no. He was a really particular character named Hardy. He was a disciple of Ruth Duckworth, who I didn't even know who she was at the time. But he had a real problem with art and commerce, and actually was very bitter, and just didn't even want to think about art and the gallery scene. So he said no, but something important that he said to me after saying no is, "Why do you want to make a big ceramic?" And this is one of these moments, I have a few in the presentation, that I just want to highlight, because it wasn't that you shouldn't make big ceramics, but I thought it made me think about why. And he continued that conversation and said, it's a particular material. It doesn't really lend itself, at least in his eyes, to making big work. There's other materials. There's paper mache. There's all things. And I guess, again, not being in a setting like this, it was a learning moment for me. And it was, I think because I wasn't so assured yet, he kind of influenced my answer. Maybe today I would have said, "I don't care what you think, I want to make something big." But where it challenged me is I started to make really small things. I thought, maybe I'm not going to make anything big. I'm going to make a show that's all just little pieces. And so the first thing I made for the show was this piece, which is maybe this high. And I bring it up only in that it was the first thing that sold at the show. And it was just a good lesson. It was just a good lesson to think about why you, in terms of scale. So this was the show. It was called Friday, June the 1st, 2018, and the title of the show was the day that I did the show, because every piece in the show was titled the day that the pieces were made. And I think the reason I did that was, again, I'm going to this is who I am. I was going through a divorce. Well, I didn't know it was going to be a divorce at the time, but everything that I was making was extremely personal. But I still, I believed, and I started to learn about the open object. And so I think that was an important aspect to my work, is that, it is made from some deep things inside, but I think those don't necessarily need to always be revealed to the viewer, so that you leave it open and that the viewer can come to it and think or feel, pull out from it their own experiences. So yeah, I was mixing different clay bodies. I was still in this beginning, you can see I was doing low fire, high fire. I was glazing. I was finishing with different details. Yeah. And actually, during, you saw the beginning of my home, I had 2 little kids and had laid this out on the floor as like the possibility. And 2 weeks before this show, my kids put blankets over their heads and ran into the living room and broke 3 of the pieces. But that was very real, and I cried and was very worried. But again, another learning moment. One, why did I have my ceramics in the middle of the floor? But this is how I live. But also the challenge of having to say, okay, let it go, and either make something new or pivot. It's possible. This was another view. I can say I always never liked the color of the volume floor. It was my only issue with this, but I couldn't change their floor. And you'll see in a few slides later why that might be funny. But I did end up making like a bigger piece away from that art center, and that was the piece on the pedestal over there. So that was probably the biggest piece I had made thus far. This was another little kind of experimental piece that I ended up thinking, this is the other thing where I talk about play and really just never throwing things away. This was a mixture of clay that was kind of stuff that I was going to throw out, and then I just quickly thought, I'm going to make something just so I don't waste it. I was very conscious of that, wasting clay, throwing it away. And it ended up being a piece I kept and I still love a lot. And an early one that I started adding glaze to. I show these only because that ended up being in it. It was a drain piece that kind of had also historical value. It ended up looking a little bit like a German lace dolly, which kind of was an ode to my mother. And the thing on the left I only added because it came up as I was looking for slides, but it's sort of a funny thing that while I was working on that show, I kind of was doing this on the floor, and it never turned into anything, but this is now like 10 years later, and I don't know, it just shows you experimentation of things that make it in and don't make it in, and just being a bit free in the way that you can kind of take pieces that you make. And I was sort of, laying things out beside other pieces, which would continue to be a way that I make. I tend to sort of have a lot of things around, and I move things a lot around. I wanted to show this piece, which was made during that first show. Someone had given me a kiln, and I didn't really know how to use it, so I started making work in my basement, and something fell apart. And, there was something positive at that. I think something positive always involves a collapse and a recreation to create something that always built on each other, pushing things out, building again, assembling things again. And this piece was nominated for the Loewe Craft Prize, which I didn't even know about at the time, just so you know. So it's not something I applied with, but it's just this. It's just to say, you never know. It's like just keep making a mess and keep playing, and yeah, when you kind of get out of your way and just let the material or what you're doing, yeah, good things can happen out of that. Just a few more close-ups from that show. Porcelain, which I wasn't working a lot with, and a house breaking apart. So yeah, I also wanted to say, like, as I show you more, like, I think my work sort of started becoming almost transitional objects. There's sort of ways in which I sort of I move through the world. I mean, for better or for worse. I mean, it can get exhausting, but I think that's what they are. They're a space to hold what I sometimes can't, and an opportunity to propose a conversation or tap into something in all of us. These are just close-ups of, the pinching technique I use. In the beginning, it was more outwards, so this, you would actually see that, and then as I go on, it'll turn a little inward. Another close-up. Okay, video break. Oops. Oh, yeah. This is inside my space. I guess I put that there because there was another teaching moment. I had seen a talk by Carrie James Marshall, and at the time, again, after you get a show, you start thinking about, what kind of artist you want to be, where you need to be. I'd been in New York for 20 years and seen a lot of friends come up in the art world, want to be famous artists, whatever that means. And it was in this talk with Carrie James Marshall. Do you know who he is? Yeah, at this point. I didn't know who he was, but he said something in this talk, and it was, he specifically said, you don't need to be in New York to make art, and you don't need to be in New York to become a famous artist or do any of it. Look around you. Paint what you know. Look at your floor. Look out the window. And so, I took that to heart, and I started, just as I was thinking about ideas, and I started looking around, and I have 4 cats, and I started looking at cat towers, and this is a place where I was thinking about 3D. Anyway, this was an interesting thing that I haven't resolved, but I started sketching cat towers, and I think what it also did was, I just thought it was an interesting concept architecturally. I thought it was a challenge, which I realized I wasn't technically prepared for yet. So I think it's a good place to bring in like a kind of, you can benefit from being a self-taught artist. There's constraints in having an art education, but then there's constraints not having it. So I think both you can come to the constraint from different sides. And I think I may have had more freedom when I started not knowing, but then I butted up against what I didn't know. And clay is not like painting. It's, there's technical issues. So I kind of quickly abandoned the cat tower project, which I want to come back to, but yeah. Anyway, I wanted to show you them. I think I also liked that it was something that was like maybe conventionally thought of as ugly, that a lot of us had in our homes, and I think maybe there's other objects that fit that criteria, but that we keep in our homes because of someone or something we love. And so I thought there was a lot of room there to use this as something interesting. More examples of, I started to try to technically challenge myself. A lot of the pieces are very organic. And so I started trying to make things that were a little like mimicked buildings, but it was also an exercise to start teaching myself how to be straighter, how to build upwards. I just wanted to show this project. This came to me in Hyde Park. There was a woman I know, Romy Crawford, and she was starting a project called the Museum of, Vernacular Arts and Knowledge. And it was kind of interesting because she picked a few different artists and asked us to go out onto the street based on a 1960s idea where artists just go out on the street and teach people walking by about an artist. Mine was Marva Jolly, and if you don't know her, she's an African-American ceramic artist, Chicago, didn't get a lot of recognition, and I think is about to, because she was an early teacher of Theaster Gates, if you know him. He's a Chicago artist. And she was a teacher. She was a ceramic teacher in small public studios in Chicago. And it forced me to learn about her. And then, I moved around Hyde Park with pictures of her work, pictures of my work. I'd never actually made a pinch pot, and part of what she did was she called them story pots. And so I thought a good way to engage with the public was to get people to make story pots. And I literally had a table. But it was kind of a pretty special project. But what was really nice about this, again, a teaching moment, and my work I kind of started to develop a language through story pots. And I just started sculpturally attaching them together. And these are examples of work that came out of that experience without really an intention. This one's called Thought Bubbles on the Edge of a Nest. This was an early one. I started again drawing on them. They took on like cloud-like forms, but I saw them sort of as a psychology. Again, it was sort of about, you, but about me, like the pots being different parts of our, being what we were thinking. This one was called Internal Goya. I started painting, like this was I was starting to glaze and then not getting what I wanted, so I actually started adding paint, oil paint, to pieces. These were sort of a couple of pieces that also developed out of the story pots. This was a take on the croque-en-bouche. I called it a croque-en-tête. And again, just to show you, this is real. I have these objects all around the house, and so it's another way to interact with them and sort of figure out, just look at them. I look at them all the time, and it sort of takes a path. Okay.
And deep down in my little finger,
oh, shoot. Can you hear that?
This relationship between the knowledge and feeling of our bodies, smallest parts, that permeates.
Can you hear that?
Yes.
Oh, okay. So this is just an introduction to my second show, which happened during COVID, so not an easy time to have it, but also not an easy time for me. And the show was called And Deep Down in My Little Finger. I was going through something quite difficult emotionally, a depression, one that was far worse than, I'd never had something like that before. And Volume said, we're ready to give you your second show. So, it's not something that you say no to, or at least I didn't think I could. And in the end, the only thing that I really could do for a certain amount of time in my studio was wrap a piece of clay around my little finger. But the surprising thing was, and again, that this constraint of being down led me to was an openness in my practice that I had always wanted to get to. I wanted to be bigger than a vessel. And it allowed me to write a poem in clay, to make a show that was an installation rather than a presentation of separate vessels. And I carpeted the gallery. So I just was making, I was making these molds, and the molds then, I started kind of making piles out of them. So they became vessels that sort of took on titles of correspondence that was sort of happening at the time. So these ones are called, the black one's More Committed, the brown one Feeling Like Shit, Flourish, One Sunday Morning. And then the wall piece was called Poof, 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 Poof. Flourish again. And this is just, I wanted to show you sort of a picture in my studio of how things were sort of playing out. And again, I show you this again, at kind of a technical challenge. The original poof, which I still think I will do, the poof piece, I think actually, I wanted it to be that. I wanted it to be the piece with the word, and I think it actually was stronger. But I hadn't made flat things. I hadn't made things that were cut out, and I think these things needed to be almost as perfect, at least for me. And I didn't have access to a kiln. I didn't have access to the studio where I could work on things or ask questions. And so I just, for me, I couldn't get them as perfect as I wanted them to be. But yeah, and okay. That's a piece of One Sunday Morning, which was based on a Wilco song. Where I Ache was a kind of a poem that was on the wall. During this time also, I became a winter swimmer. And that also helped, like this was something, the pools were closed, I started swimming to deal with sort of my emotional state, and it started to also work its way into the show with this, not this piece, this was called Damned. These were pieces of clay that were sort of molded on places of my body that had significance. This was the table, I had actually left all of them. That was my actual studio table that I just made into the piece with the aches on it. Something I wanted to show I was working on at the time also, like on my studio floor, it was the water and it wasn't resolved, but just to give you an idea of the play. After this show, I had never done any residencies, and I got 4 back to back. And I wanted to talk about them because I do think that they were milestones for me in terms of my practice. Everything that I was doing up until this point was in my studio, my little basement studio. And so, like I told you, my work is often about what's going on inside me, or where I am physically, and I think that the residencies gave me a challenge. Making work about my emotional state was starting to become exhausting, quite frankly. And so I started giving myself parameters and tackle questions outside of me. So I started in Columbia, Indiana, that had a lot of sarin, and I started looking at buildings, and I came out of that thinking, a lot about churches, a lot about my feelings about institutionalized religion, and I thought in terms of a form, that would be an interesting form to start challenge. This steeple form would be an interesting form to challenge myself with. There was a lot of public sculpture there, so I started sort of working on ideas about public sculpture, what could be something interesting for the community to interact with. I started thinking about children. I'd had the psychological sort of cloud, so these were sort of little maquettes I started making about, using primary colors, shapes as teaching tools, envisioning people sitting around, kids playing around. This happened in Lakeside. I was someone also that was really wanting to make a public sculpture. So I turned the aches into an idea of a collective cairn, and the people staying at the place, I asked them to make their own fingerprint and sort of made a collective sculpture there. I then moved to Township 10, which was in North Carolina, and was still I went there thinking I was going to work on the steeples, and the steeples quite quickly were influenced by the rolling hills and the bees around me. And so what started out as these steeples started to soften. I know I'm getting long, so cut me off at some point. These were drawings that I started making, thinking about the idea of what if our steeples were softened. So that was just thinking about ideas outside of myself. Throwing clay against where the bees were making their nests. And, again, my pinching became, I feel like, more sophisticated there. I started turning the pinch out, so it almost, without even realizing it, started to mimic the nests that the mud daubers were making. So where I am physically and what I'm looking at tends to really influence what I'm making, even if I don't go in planning it. This one was made there, so it was, again, using those pinching methods, wrapping methods. And this is like more formal pictures of what came out of that residency. So I kept the steeples, but I started making these big slabs to mimic landscapes and cloud cover and, again, sort of softening of these sharp steeples. Quickly, this was Hyde Park Arts Center residency. Living in Chicago, I also started to question, why am I making things? I want to make things that influence people. Does the world need more objects? There's a lot of activist art. I went into this residency thinking, how can I be more of an activist? And I guess my point is that, I kind of failed. Everything that I started making there was very literal. It was very direct, and I was trying to be someone that I wasn't, and I sort of realized by just making what I make, and if you think about the world and the ideas that you have around it, it eventually, it enters your work. Your hand is your hand, and yeah. So this was a project, though, that came out of it that was nice, where I provided the bases, and I did sort of like a community garden workshop where I asked participants to make the top piece. This was more of this finger collective cairns. We installed one on an abandoned base in front of Lake Michigan. This is just sort of to give you an example of the continuum of work, and this was different shows, different pieces shown together at another fair, but how there is a path and that it's working. And then I jump into the last show I did in New York was with Jacqueline Sullivan Gallery, and it was an interesting place because she does sort of a mise en place. So it was interacting objects with 60s furniture and actually American craft. But also taking, what was nice about this is I think, that last show, it was hard for me to imagine that room being dismantled because it was so much, it was me. It was really me. And she wanted some pieces from that show, and I couldn't keep it intact. And I think what ended up happening with this is it was really freeing to see that what volume said to me during that show was pieces shouldn't go on the floor, which I thought was kind of ridiculous and difficult from an artful point of view, because many artists have put pieces on the floor. She actually just intuitively put those pieces on a carpet for this show without me even telling her how to display them. So I just think that's interesting how sometimes when you want the control and you can't get it, and then you put it in the hands of someone else and they do exactly sort of what you wanted. And it was freeing to release them from that room that they were in. And during this time, again, the work that I'm sort of working on now are, I wanted to show you my dining room table, because again, I tend to like layer things in my view a lot. So things start growing because I put something behind something and I see it and then I'm like, oh wow, like maybe I should like build up upon like that like building that I made, maybe the conical shapes that were happening in North Carolina, that could kind of be an interesting development. And then without even knowing it, in keeping with this sort of, these things someone said, oh, Jen, they look like pagodas. And I'm like, oh, I wasn't even thinking that. So they became these almost spiritual architectural forms that then felt sort of timely, because I was thinking they kind of became like funeraries of like things to let go of and things to move on in. The title actually kind of maybe, didn't match, but gave one something to think about. So this one was thing to move on in, thing to grow in another direction in. Thinking about these structures as a progression from a place of worship to a building that eventually turns into the flowers that we lay upon them. So I started thinking, almost that the buildings and places of worship, places that we die, places that we memorialize, turning into the flowers that we actually lay upon them. What you do in sculpture, I think this feels relevant, is somehow take matter and try to make a transmission of spiritual energy into matter. And then hopefully that object, when it leaves you, some of that energy is transmitted back to the viewer somehow. I mean, it's just something to think about. I show this because, again, as a person that doesn't like to glaze, this is something I'm experimenting with, because I feel like also like when I decided not to throw pots, because I just think I never was going to be as good as people that throw pots. And then glazing, there's gloopy glaze, there's all kinds of glazing, and I didn't want to be the other gloopy glazer. And so this is the beginning of sort of thinking about a way to stipple glaze, and it's something that, I don't know, maybe someone has done it before, but it's something for me that feels kind of painterly. It feels like something I can control. And so the beginning of something I'm exploring as a way for me to add color to a piece. More from this series. Thing to sit in quietly, tight and small in a corner. And then these, another important quote. I have a friend, Laura Latinsky. She's a photographer. She's the chair of the department at U of Chicago. And through the process of seeing my making and my emotional state of mind, at one point she posed the question, what would joy look like? And I sort of had to think about that in my work. A lot was inspired by things that pained me. But I started to think about flowers, and I started to think about my mother, and I thought maybe if I just make a flower every day, flowers for my mother, that would be something unexpected would come out of that. And so I almost feel like I'll make flowers for my mother for the rest of my life. I feel like this could be just something that I always make, even when I don't know what to make. And then I'm just going to now kind of wrap up, but just show you. And please ask questions along this way, but these are just recent things that I'm going to show you. This is part of Flowers for My Mother. It was a bouquet, and what you'll notice is I've started in the last few months painting, like taking oil paint and sort of coming back to the painter that I am and painting on the work. Some of these just unhappy with glaze, but also just realizing how much I love using oil paint on ceramics. Rising sea levels around my heart, isn't it this is called? This was part of Flowers for My Mother, Tilt. This is another one of these fountain pieces that I painted on, Flesh Fountain. I've started making trees, thinking about tree shapes. Oil painting it. Hang 10, this is called. This was a series of vessels I did maybe like, I'm going to say 8 years ago. They were something I was thinking about, bags and vessels, women carrying things. And I wasn't happy with them, but I put them aside and, you know, again, repurposed. I ended up painting these pieces. This was a flower for my mother that I wasn't happy with, but then started thinking about it as a painted piece, and it reminded me of a soft serve. So it's called soft serve. Using molded things that I'd used 10 years ago and sort of now coming back again, you know, playing with the cutouts, how to paint on the object with glaze, you know, being a bit looser with it, incorporating my mark making again. Things to hold waves in, things to build forests in. There's an environmental component. Starting to be more playful, adding some animal elements. Maybe this is me finding joy. And this is sort of a new, I want to just kind of end with this. This is a new language I'm sort of starting. It's like just like a, I don't know, I hadn't been in the studio for a while, and it just shows you I just started rolling some clay into my hands and putting it on. And then I showed a friend, and this friend said, that looks threatening. And I think this is just interesting about yourself and what people say. Like when he said that, I was like, oh, you know, like it kind of bothered me. And I realized, oh, like my whole life, like I've had anger, I'm not comfortable with anger, I'm not comfortable with conflict, I'm not comfortable, you know, with discomfort. And so I almost think, and when I said, oh, he said, well, what the piece is called, What's Wrong with Threatening? And I think what it, again, kind of taught me is you can work that stuff out, you know? It's like, I think of myself as something, but what is wrong with threatening? And I don't mean in a, you know, a direct way that you would threaten someone else, but why is that a language that possibly I'm visiting? What am I dealing with? And so I'm just going to show you, these are some pretty new pieces using this technique that I'm afraid to glaze. Like you see, I'm contemplating. I've started using these little cups that I make as glaze tests. So I've probably, I've been doing this for 10 years. I've just started glaze testing. And it's because I can do it on something that I can use for something else. And I guess, hopefully this makes sense. I think I wrote it late, but you know, I think everyone wants to get it right somehow, right? Like, what does that mean? But I think getting it wrong or missteps or learning as you go, and to keep going, to get to a better place somehow is really, that's the living. Imposter syndrome is real. Like, I'm gonna say thank you. I mean, I really, like, I don't think maybe 3 days ago, I had like a full panic attack about doing this. yeah, why am I here? I think, and this speaks to something maybe Alice and I were talking about, when you grow up, and I think we're a society too, but when you grow up, let's say my father represents society that somehow tells you that art isn't as important. We carry shame around with it. So I think for me, I didn't start making this stuff until I was 46. I think I was around, I talked to Ian, really well-known, big artists that are big artists. I couldn't do the work. And I don't know if that was connected to this shame, but even when I'm alone, being someone creative, you have to spend time alone. And I think it's hard for me because I think there is that voice that comes out, I should be doing something else. So that's why this is such a gift, to have this time to not think about doing anything else, because it's important. And I think, allowing people to see my vulnerability, my missteps, it's also an important part, letting you record this and put it up on YouTube so everyone can see where I, fucked up. It keeps a conversation going and it keeps us connected. This is the last piece I made in the studio. So I'm going to show you that. That was a few weeks ago. Kind of more of this new language working itself in. I'll end with me as a little kid, preschool, by the easel. I think art, or at least for me, it's a cake that's always baking. Wherever I am, I'm looking at something. I'm not I heard a term somewhere called studio rat. I'm not a studio rat. I would like to be a studio rat. But, sometimes you feel guilty that you take a day off, or I take many days off. But that's also part of the process of having the time to just sort of walk around, think. And then when I make something, it's often very quickly, because I think I'm always thinking about it without even knowing it. So I encourage, if you can find whatever it is, an hour, or you're going to have many hours, to play and be messy, or be really neat, or whatever it takes. That time's important. This is my little studio. So I have a little studio in my basement, and I tend to bring everything up into my house because I don't have the room in my studio, but it sort of all works together, which I want all of you, please, if you're in Chicago, just call me. I'll make coffee. And I'll end with this quote from a new friend, Dan McCarthy. What drives me emotionally, intuitive handling of wet, heavy clay that is constantly in a state of drying out, instinctively working this material into shapes with a sense of immediacy and buoyant. Best to start from the ground up, making things that make sense to me without wondering how they fit in and why. Trust what I know and go. I'd like to make something that taps into the bigger here and now, creating an object that becomes directed towards engaging a brighter future. Mine is an emotional proposal. That's Dan McCarthy. You should all look up his work. He's a special person. Yeah, that's it. Thank you. That's Lake Michigan.
Thanks so very much for sharing with us. There's a few minutes for question and answer, if you're willing.
Please,
Great.
please.
I've got the mic here, so great.
I really enjoyed your the cat scratcher pieces, and I was wondering if you ever got to introduce those to your cats and what their reactions were.
That's so funny. When I first made it, I think they're perplexed. I think they're perplexed, but I think one, in fact, has scratched one when I run out of, things to give them. Yeah. It's curious, you know. I think it's funny because I had showed the gallery like early on when I was thinking about these. They were sort of unsure, but I got a proposal to design a cat scratcher for someone, which I never did. It was like almost too much pressure. But yeah, anyway. Thank you.
I can ask a question.
Yeah.
So, I mean, since we, I think I'll just, since, since you showed us so much of a trajectory from start to end, which is great. Can you, I mean, it's one thing that I think we talk about a lot in the ceramics department is sort of as you get better at, quote unquote better, or as you work with something more, a material more, you learn about it more. Can you describe the change that's happened in the work? Talk to a little bit about, do you feel the work is changing because of your further intimate knowledge of the material, or?
No, absolutely. I think for me it's a feeling, right? It becomes like malleable. I think I feel, I mean, I'll always take risks. I sometimes, to a fault, almost like shield myself from information, which again, like I say, doesn't do you service when, but I think in the building, yeah, just the way, you know, I know usually when something won't collapse because I've gotten too high. So it's almost just knowing, yeah, either when, you know, when to stop with it. Yeah.
It's kind of a nebulous question I gave you there, or kind of, but the idea that do you find that knowing the material more is meaningful to the meaning of the work? There's skill building.
There's skill building.
There's knowledge building, and then there's something else.
You know, it's interesting you're asking that because it's something that I think about all the time. And I don't know if it is for me. You know, it's hard for me to answer because I've only made this sculptural work with clay. But I think it comes back to that question that Hardy asked me. Why do you want to make this big, and then sort of proposing like these other materials, which I think, like, again, that's why I'm doing the talk in this department. But I think I even have those questions for myself. Could I expand to other materials? You know, and I think I've only gotten to that question because of the time I've spent with the clay. You know, there's been points in time where I've wanted to add paper mache to the top, and I didn't show you guys early work. I was tying string to it, and I feel like that may be somewhere that I'm going. I'm not sure yet, and that also comes with, listen, I think like it's where I almost want to talk about working backwards in a way, like. I kind of want to come to art school. You know, it's like, I feel like that may, or something like that, having the discipline and the walls and the structure to sort of work within, to sort of figure out those questions. So yeah, it's a good question because it's really applicable to like, oh, like, am I going to start doing sculpture? And you know what, it's funny, actually, this new, really, it's not that I never painted on ceramics, but I wanted to be a painter. I wanted to use oil paint, and I'm wondering if, like, I joke that, like, painting with oil on the material is actually, like, just, like, another step towards getting back to the canvas, or, you know, or maybe incorporating other material with clay that I paint on. I don't know, yeah.
Hi there.
Hi.
Thank you so much for this talk. Really wonderful. I have a sort of parallel practice question. You know, the things we do outside of making that maintain the studio, or I was interested in your for their first moments when you sent your work out into the world, showing in shops. And I wondered if, it seemed like you were lucky to have great people to work with in those situations. But I wonder if you still might have learned things to do and things not to do, what kind of relationships to create with shops in particular that might be useful with hindsight.
I think that this is an ongoing, I think I talk a lot, and I'm sure you guys will too, I talk a lot with people about, for me, the shop thing was convenient, and yes, I think I was in an exceptional situation where, and it's why I brought it up, the shops that I had access to through my fashion background that I knew, listen, this is maybe where the design marketing degree and like doing press for Miguel came in. Like I knew the people that were looking at the objects in those shops were people that were regulating galleries. I knew the clientele. And that, I don't mean to sound, that almost feels like I feel arrogant or that they were specialized, but I guess I just knew that the eye that was looking at the work, right? But I think like the world is changing, right? And I think there's so many different ways to look at things, and I think it's more about personal comfort than maybe what it looks like to anybody else on the outside. I guess the best example I can give, and I think again, it's like you have to visit in, because I think a lot of people would be like, why would I if I put my things in a shop, then it's gonna like be seen or regarded as not art. It's gonna be seen as sort of a retail object for sale, or, where you place your things has consequence. I deal with it even with what is design and what is art, and people are, it's a lifelong argument, and I think you can either allow yourself to play into that, is it pedagogy? I don't know, what it's supposed to be, or I think as the gallery world is collapsing and people are finding new ways and how to sell work and how to, it's hard to be an artist. A few people make it big, but it's even when people make it big to sustain a certain amount, and even should a work of art ever be that expensive? I don't know, I struggle with that. So I'm still learning. I guess a practical thing that I learned is, ceramics, you have to ship them in a particular way, and the things that I was bringing to these shops, it was a joke. I ended up giving things to the place in London, and because I'm also very messy, and I just kind of threw these things in a box and sent them, and half of them broke. They were really amazing sculptures, but I was so, I think logistics, yeah. Did that answer that? Yeah, I can expand more. We could talk about, how things are viewed, where they're viewed. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Yeah.
That's good dinner conversation, yes, yes.
Thanks again, Jennifer.
Oh my gosh, thank you guys.